Thank you. Thanks to Acapella Books and the Carter Library for having me. I've had this Georgia trip circled on my calendar for several months now. I'm going to Savannah and Augusta after this. Really looking forward to it, and delighted to share this with y'all. Writing is a very solitary pursuit. I worked on this book for almost 4 years, so to share it with people face to face is incredible for me, so thank you for being here. I just want to walk you guys back to when I first had the idea for this book. It was October 2009. And I was reading the New York Times Metro section, and there was a very little piece in there about a man named Luis Armando Peña Soltron. And he had been a Puerto Rican nationalist living in the Bronx in the late 60s with a wife and young daughter. And in 1968, he and two of his comrades decided to hijack a plane from New York to Cuba. And he actually spent the next 41 years living in Cuba until all of a sudden, at the age of 66, he decided to come back to the US and reunite with his wife and now adult daughter. And this piece was just about him being arrested the second he stepped off the plane at JFK. And I was intrigued, first of all, because I'm always attracted to stories about fugitives and exiles. That's kind of my sweet spot, so it was definitely something that I was attracted to. But second of all, just because I thought, well, how can you get away with a hijacking, which is maybe the most taboo, frightening crime I can think of today, for 41 years, and I'd never heard of this guy before. And I was always vaguely familiar with this period in American history when people would take planes to Cuba, but I didn't really know much about it. And so I started looking into his case, and I was just overwhelmed by the sheer number of hijackings in this time period, late 60s, early 70s. Between 1968 and the end of 1972, there were over 130 hijackings in America, sometimes at a rate of more than one a week, sometimes 2 a day. And I was looking for a story in here I could explore more deeply. And I was looking for people who had been fugitives for many years after hijacking planes. And I was looking at the list of people that were still on the run or had been on the run for many years, and it was pretty much an all-male crew. And all of a sudden, I saw this one woman's name on there, Catherine Marie Kirko, a 20-year-old woman from a small town, Coos Bay, Oregon. And I was just intrigued. I just thought, well, what would make this 20-year-old woman turn her back on everything she'd ever known to hijack a plane to a foreign country and never be able to come home again? And so that kind of became a 4-year obsession for me, a long journey to tell that story. I'm going to start, though, by telling you not about her story and the story of her accomplice, but more about the general history of hijacking in America. And it actually started in 1961, was the first hijacking in America. It was May 1st, 1961. A Cuban exile whipped out a steak knife on a Miami to Key West flight and told the pilot that he wanted to go to Havana to warn Fidel Castro about an assassination attempt orchestrated by the Dominican Republic's dictator. And shortly after that, there were several other hijackings, and it became an epidemic. We'd have outbreaks, and there'd be clusters of these hijackings. And then they kind of fall off for a little bit, and then they come roaring back, kind of crazier and more violent. But in this time period, in the mid to even late 60s, all people wanted to do was go to Cuba. There was one exception. There was one guy who wanted to go to Smackover, Arkansas to reunite with his estranged wife, but exception proves the rule. All people wanted to do was go to Cuba, which they thought would be this amazing socialist paradise where they would get parades down a central Havana Avenue and live these glorious lives, when in fact that didn't happen at all. Fidel Castro wanted nothing to do with these people. He considered them dangerous and nutty, and he would usually throw them in prison for long stretches, and people would begging to come back. Now, the airlines had a choice during this time period, the mid to late 60s. There was basically no security at all at this time. You could literally walk from the curbside all the way, sometimes onto your plane, without having a ticket, without having ID, without having anyone ask what you're carrying or checking what you're doing. So you could bring anything onto a plane you wanted. So when these hijackings started happening in huge bunches, the airlines had a choice. They said, well, we can spend millions of dollars and buy metal detectors and security personnel to staff them, and not only that, but force people to be searched, and they might feel like criminal suspects and be bummed out and not want to fly anymore. Or we could just put up with 20 to 40 hijackings a year, and just comply with everything the hijackers want, and we'll get the plane back, and the passengers will be safe, and we'll lose like 20,000 bucks per hijacking, but that's not that bad. So they're basically treating it like a managed risk at this time. I'm going to read you a little bit from the book now, a short passage about why it was a mistake to treat skyjacking as a managed risk. The airline's harm reduction strategy was contingent on the assumption that the epidemic's basic features would never change, that the perpetrators would always be either sad sacks or Cuban exiles whose sole intent was to reach Havana with a minimum of fuss. But as the hijackings piled up with little apparent resistance from the airlines or the authorities, the crime's appeal broadened to new demographics of the disenchanted. The epidemic first revealed its metamorphosis on the second day of 1969, when a young African-American couple, Tyrone and Linda Austin, took over an Eastern Airlines flight en route from New York to Miami. Tyrone was the aggressor, announcing the hijacking by holding a gun to the head of a 2-year-old boy and shouting, "Black Power, Havana! Black Power, Havana!" Though the Austins' revolutionary credentials were sketchy, Tyrone's real objective was to flee a felony arrest warrant in New Jersey. Their success in drawing media attention would soon inspire more sincere black militants to embrace skyjacking as a key tactic in their struggle. Later that month, a 19-year-old Navy deserter hijacked a national airlines flight from Key West to Havana, telling a stewardess at knife point that he refused to shed blood in Vietnam. It was the first American hijacking in which a member of the military cited his opposition to the war as a motive. It would by no means be the last. By the second week of February 1969, 11 flights had been commandeered in the US, a record pace. In addition to the Austins and the Navy deserter, the hijackers included a former mental patient, accompanied by his 3-year-old son, a community college student armed with a can of bug spray, a Purdue University dropout with a taste for Marxist economics, and a retired Green Beret who claimed that he intended to assassinate Fidel Castro with his bare hands. At the behest of the House Committee on Interstate and Foreign Commerce, the FAA formed a special anti-hijacking task force to develop possible solutions to the crisis. The group was immediately inundated with thousands of letters from concerned citizens who recommended inventive ways to frustrate skyjackers, installing trap doors outside cockpits, arming stewardesses with tranquilizer darts, making passengers wear boxing gloves so they couldn't grip guns, playing the Cuban national anthem before takeoff and then arresting anyone who knew the lyrics. The most popular suggestion was for the FAA to build a mock version of Jose Marti International Airport in South Florida Field so that skyjackers could be duped into thinking that they had reached Havana. That idea sparked serious interest at the agency, but was ultimately discarded as too expensive. As the FAA's task force sifted through the mountain of proposals, the hijackings continued apace, each more outlandish than the last. A 74-year-old World War I veteran pulled a knife on an Eastern stewardess in the skies above South Carolina. A Black Panther, wanted for his role in a San Francisco shootout, hijacked a TWA Boeing 707 over Nevada. An alcoholic used car dealer from Baltimore took over an Eastern flight while wearing Bermuda shorts and sandals so that he could hit the beach upon landing in Havana. So shortly after this, there is one of two real milestone hijackings that really escalate the epidemic. This is the hijacking committed by an Italian-American Marine named Rafael Minichiello. He had served in Vietnam and had earned a Purple Heart, and upon coming back to the US, he had demanded the money he felt he was owed. He told the Marines to hold his salary. He thought he had earned $800 while in Vietnam. The Marines told him he was wrong, he'd only earned $600. And this became a huge sore spot for him, a real affront to his honor in his eyes. So he ended up burglarizing the post exchange at his base for exactly $200 worth of goods. And for this, he was court-martialed. And so he decided to hijack a plane that was going from LA to San Francisco. Now, he didn't want to go to Cuba. He wanted to go to Italy. He was the first hijacker in America ever to want to go somewhere other than Cuba, other than the guy who wanted to go to Arkansas who was crazy. And so TWA, the airline in question, had no policy in place for what happens if a hijacker wants to go somewhere other than Havana. And they make a decision to let him go, to fly him to Italy. where he is greeted in Rome as a huge hero and sex symbol. He was very